Raga.
Good afternoon from Paris, dear colleagues, dear governing board members, dear partners, distinguished speakers. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to this Dev Talk on how we can work together to do a better job at including forcibly displaced people in host countries, social protection systems, and in society more generally. This discussion is very urgent and very important at a time where there are over 100 million people that have been forcibly displaced in the world today. My name is Raga Arnardóttir, and I'm the director of the OECD Development Center. And it's a great pleasure for me to pass the floor for the introductory remarks to my good colleague at the Development Co-operation Directorate, Mayumi Endo, the Deputy Director of DCD, who is going to introduce the topic for us and set the scene before we move into the discussion with our speakers that I will introduce when we have heard the introductory remarks by Mayumi. Mayumi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Raga, for those words. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. And I'd like to thank Raga for giving us the opportunity to speak at this very important event. We're currently going through unprecedented times in many aspects, and this is true also in terms of forced displacement. In 2022, the scale of global forced displacement has reached the highest level, surpassing 100 million refugees and internally displaced people in light of the Ukraine crisis and other conflicts. Compounded by food and fertilizer crisis, this is affecting socio-economic development and fragility worldwide. Formal, durable solutions for the forcibly displaced, such as returning home, local integration, or settlement elsewhere, remain difficult for many and are by far outpaced by new forced displacement. Therefore, practical solutions such as socio-economic inclusion in host communities and related development cooperation support are very important, and right policies need to be applied. It is in this context that OECD Development Center and Development Co-operation Directorate and the Swedish Expert Group for AIDS Studies have come together to issue a policy paper on social protection for the forcibly displaced. Social protection is one important pathway for inclusion of forcibly displaced people. The main findings of the policy study includes, first, in the 12 low and middle income countries examined, de jure or legal inclusion of refugees and IDPs is relatively good, while de facto inclusion, which is refugees and IDPs actually assisted by social protection systems, is very low. Second, there are significant data gaps, and refugees and IDPs largely remain invisible in databases, which are important for targeting and planning. Third, the political economy of the context and political will are key determining factors for successful inclusion. The policy study also illustrated that more evidence and policy guidance is required in support of the Global Compact on Refugees and the UN Secretary General's Action Agenda on Internal Displacement. In the next steps, the OECD Joint DCD Development Center Work Plan on Forced Displacement will examine the following. First, it will respond to forced displacement through national development plans and donor development cooperation strategies, a global baseline on how far the inclusion premise has been applied and what can be done to advance it. Second, the peace dimension of humanitarian development peace nexus in forced displacement situations, including the role of political will and how to mobilize it. Third, urbanization and the inclusion of refugees and IDPs in urban planning strategies. This panel event is to shed light on what has been done and what the future policy agenda on forced displacement should focus on in host countries and in development cooperation strategies by the international communities. So with these words, I hand back to the floor to you, Raga. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Mayumi. This was an excellent kickoff to our discussion. And speaking of discussion, now allow me to turn to our impressive panel, a panel of speakers that we have the privilege of hosting here today. And just to give you a quick introduction, we have with us here Mr. Jean-Patrice Coe, Jr. He's the Assistant Director in charge of relations with the International Organization for Migration, the IMO, in Cameroon's Ministry of External Relations. We have Mr. Sajjad Malik, who is the Director for the Division of Resilience and Solution at the Unhcr. And just as a footnote, we are starting a new partnership with the Unhcr regarding the DCD Dev work plan on forced displacement. Next, we have Ms. Helena Lindholm. She is the chairperson of the Swedish expert group for AIDS studies, the EPA, and also a little footnote here. Helena Lindholm chaired the reference group of our DCD Dev EPA study on social protection for refugees and IDPs. So thank you very much for that good cooperation, Helena. And last but not least, we have Mr. Eric Zapatero Lario, who is the Senior Social Protection Specialist from the World Bank. A warm welcome to all of you. And just before we begin the debate with our distinguished speakers, just a note to say that we will open the debate to everyone in the audience in about an hour, and you will be able to submit your questions through the chat. And also, if you would like to ask your question in live, you can let us know, and then we will make the necessary arrangements to let you in. And this is all, of course, time allowing, so I have to be a strict but mild at the same time moderator to keep us on track. So let's go to the first round of questions. Mayumi did an excellent job of painting the contextual picture. Turning now to our experts so that we can get right into the purpose of today's Dev Talk, which is to identify solutions and how to implement them. And I would like to begin with you, Jean-Patrice, and I will turn to each of you with the same question to start us off, and which is, what conditions do we need to have in place to enable better and more effective inclusion of forcibly displaced people in their host countries? Jean-Patrice, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you for giving me the floor, and I would like to thank the organizers, and I would like to say hi to all the participants and the speakers. And just allow me to, at the beginning of my talk, I know that I have 5 minutes. It's really strict, so we will be straightforward. Now, I have some slides that I will be sharing with the participants and the speakers. Well, I just want to share as we go that Cameroon is located in Central Africa. Just let me check here. The diapo is not going. Okay. Cameroon is located in Central Africa, and there were neighboring countries like Nigeria, Chad, Central African Republic, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Democratic Republic of Congo. But we also have a lot of security challenges these last days. As you are all aware, we have a threat of the insurgent sect Boko Haram occurring in the far north region of the country. But we also have tensions in the northwest and the southwest region where some tensions have occurred. And we also have the impact of the Central African crisis in the eastern region of Cameroon that impacts durably Cameroon with its effect. I will go directly to the question that has been asked. What are the conditions for the inclusion? But before reaching that, I would like to spell out some numbers and profile. Cameroon is hosting about 500,000 refugees and asylum seekers, about 1 million internal displaced persons, of which 52% are women, 48% are men, and about 5% live in urban areas and about 96% in rural areas. 55% of these refugees and 51% of these internal displaced persons are children. And this is very important to note that as we're going to go on in our presentation. Now, directly to the question that was asked by Raga, what are the conditions enabling inclusions of forcibly displaced persons? Now, in Cameroon, we have identified 6, but they can be more. But for this talk, we will just share 6 of the conditions. The first one is that we ensure that the implementation of the solid legal framework that we have here in Cameroon allows an accessible and equitable treatment of forcibly displaced persons, as well as to protect their rights. This is paramount. Now, second condition is that we are enhancing the cooperation between the government of Cameroon, our regional and international partners in developing funding for refugee hosting areas. That is also important, so that it promotes what? An area-based approach and increases the coverage that we can have. Now, the third condition is to promote, and this is very important, it is to promote an atmosphere of peace, harmony, and coexistence between the host communities and the forcibly displaced person. Without this condition being fulfilled, there's nothing that can happen. So there needs to be peace between the communities, the local communities, and the forcibly displaced person. And then we also have another condition is to reinforce the collection of data to allow the access of forcibly displaced person to documentation, IDs, and well as to register them for them to be registered, enrolled in registries. So this will create conditions for them to be able to ensure that they access the basic needs, such as health facilities, clean water and sanitation, but also quality education. Now, the other condition that we have, it is to promote financial and economic programs, inclusion programs. Now, you can understand that the protracted and complex nature of forced displacement requires what? It requires a life-saving humanitarian support to be dealt with and complemented by development action that will bring the financial inclusion. Now, financial inclusion will help the forcibly displaced person to cope with their basic rights, for them to restore their livelihoods, to realize their full potential, but also to build self-reliance and resilience. Now, it also helps them finally to resettle or to be repatriated in their country, because this is what is on the long term. And next and last condition that we outline, it is to strengthen our country's policy of decentralization, bringing the accountable government closer to the community. Now, strengthening our decentralization, because we have the local government and we have the central government and we have local elected officials, it is for them to be able to deal with the crisis management, but also cohesion issues. And this will also be including speeding up the transfer of skills from the local, the central government to the local elected officials. Now, this will help the forcibly displaced person to be able to reach the government, the programs that are be outlined for them, but also for authorities and bodies of the government that are dealing with forcibly displaced person to reach them and to tell them and to show them this is what we have for you. So I would like to thank you for this first round of questions, and I hope that I just stood in the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Patrice. You did very well on time, and this was very interesting. I have to admit, I like particularly the point that you emphasized, the need to promote the atmosphere of peace, harmony, and coexistence. I think that cannot be undermined. Very good. Turning now to Sayed Malik with the same questions. What conditions do we need in place to enable better and more effective inclusion of forcibly displaced people in their host countries? Mr. Malik, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raga, and thank you, Patrice, for such a good presentation on what's happening in Cameroon. Mayomi, thank you for laying out the floor for this conversation. I had in my notes to talk about this 100 million population that we have just crossed for the first time, and it's a number which is staggering, increased in over the last few months. In fact, what we've seen out of Ukraine, but also in other parts of the world, that we see numbers going way beyond from what we were used to, it posing different sets of challenges. So in this particular situation, it's so important that we continue talking about inclusion and not setting up parallel systems, because keeping these refugees, they often stay in protracted situations, on average about 17 years, if some of these displacements over the last few decades, that protractedness become a main challenge to address that. Why does inclusion mean important for UNHCR? We just would like to highlight that it's important that ensuring that refugees are included in national systems, and that includes health, education, social protection, financial services, justice, census, data. These are all important aspects, because we have want to make sure that in countries where we have these refugees hosted or displaced population have equal access to services and protection. And the systems that afford to their citizens also afford for forced displacement. Now we look at displacement in two different ways, but also, let's say, internally displaced. They are within their own country, within the jurisdiction of their own governments, but refugees coming from a country which is, they are not the citizens of those countries, that provides an additional challenge. And that's the vulnerability of the legal rights to be in that country. There's another category which we are equally worried about, is the stateless people. These are people who do not have any nationality. They're stateless, which means they're neither internally displaced nor refugees, and they pose a different set of challenges. Now, promoting legal framework, enabling their participation in socio-economic development is absolutely essential there. And if we keep in perspective some of these recent displacements, Rohingyas in Bangladesh they've gone into 7 years, Afghans in the neighboring countries for the last 40 years. We look at Somalia, South Sudan in neighboring countries for the last 30 years, society that they're living in, but it eventually, as Patrice highlighted, upon return, that they can contribute to the development of their society. So the legal framework becomes very important. Second is the facilitation of inclusion of refugees in national service. Requires support. This is in line, as also your study has highlighted, that it is in line with the Global Compact on Refugees. Inclusion in social protection systems and other areas require burden and responsibility sharing. 85% of the displaced are hosted in low and low middle income countries who do not have those resources to match the needs of this population. Even in some places where the legal framework exists, they do not have the resources to take this additional burden and responsibility. So that's why the Global Compact talks quite explicitly about burden and responsibility sharing in that area. And that becomes important, that assisting host governments to better manage and overcome the consequences of displacement becomes extremely important. Otherwise, we talk about the legal framework being there, then the resources not being there. We have a similar situation in many countries where there are opportunities, but resources are not there. Let me quickly highlight that the World Bank and a number of development partners have done tremendously supporting a number of these countries. In the World Bank, IDA 18, IDA 19, and now IDA replenishment of IDA 20, we're looking at in refugee hosting countries. These are low-income countries where IDA funding has gone in, but also for middle-income countries, the Global Concessional Financing Facility of the World Bank has provided tremendous. We have the legal framework.
Excuse me, Mr. Malik, you are breaking up. I'm wondering if we could resort to the plan B of having you try to turn off your camera and see if we can hear you better.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right, I'll switch off the camera. I'm sorry about that. So it's if I could just quickly highlight that I'm at the Transforming Education summit in Paris with the refugee team, with a team of Unhcr colleagues, making a very strong pitch at the summit for the inclusion of refugees in education systems. It's an important area that we felt it was to bring it to the policymakers, this important aspects around that. Let me just quickly highlight some of the areas, conditions that inclusion for forcibly displaced persons become important. One is that the national policy and legal framework, which is absolutely essential, that is there, that they have explicit rights to social protection and work. De jure, because it's important that inclusion is obviously there, and then ability to access benefits. So de facto inclusion becomes very important. The second important aspect is the burden and responsibility sharing, that the international financing made available to facilitate inclusion, both for refugees and their host communities. Because even in situations where refugees are in need, their host communities in more than many places, they are equally in need of that. The third is the operational and staffing capacity of the government. We just had Cameroon's example. Agencies are at the central and at the national, regional level are important to have that capacity to be there to include refugees. The other area for inclusion of refugees is data systems. Evidence, data, analytics about inclusion in social protection, education, jobs are becoming increasingly important. Documentation for refugees is paramount for them to be able to have access to services, to be able to open a bank accounts. Those civil documentation have become increasingly important. And then accompanying monitoring is an important aspect that we have now also introduced to the World Bank on Refugee Protection Review Framework, where these investments have gone in. We are monitoring the policy framework and trade-off. Raghi, I'll stop here, pass it back to you, and then wait for questions to answer.
Thank you very much, Sajjad. And I'm sorry to ask you to turn the camera off, and I would definitely ask you to turn it on again, and we can try in the next round if the connection is better. Moving now to Sweden, Helena Lindholm. The same question, just to recap, what conditions we do need in place to enable better and more effective inclusion of forcibly displaced people in their host country? Helena, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to this really important event. I would also like to say that it was a pleasure for me personally and for EBA to work together with OECD on the report, the policy paper. It was a work characterized by brilliant competence and efficiency combined. So it was really an important event to be part of this. Okay, so also thank you to Jean-Patrice and Sajjad for excellent presentations, and I will probably repeat a little bit, but I'll try not to. I'll try to phrase it in different ways, and also perhaps to highlight some of the factors that have already been brought up. In fact, the report, the policy paper, which is then labeled social protection for the forcibly displaced in low and middle income countries, in a very systematic way presents and summarizes an overview of what kind of factors that are actually facilitating, but also what kind of factors that are challenging for providing protection, social protections for refugees. And some of those factors might be pretty obvious, but nevertheless they need attention, and some need perhaps to be problematized. First of all, the report concludes that it is important that there is legislation already in place that protects and considers the rights of refugees. Of course, there is a need for economic and financial incentives, for funding, for structures, and for opportunities. It is also important that there is already some kind of a developed social protection system in place for citizens in host countries that also facilitates providing protection for refugees. Another factor which is important is that refugees are allowed to work and thus potentially included in the labor force. Further, it is important that there is support from other actors, from non-governmental organizations, for humanitarian actors, and that there is cooperation between different actors. And something which was interesting, I thought, from the report is that, which is a recent phenomenon, if refugees were included in the response to COVID-19 or not. That was actually something that had an impact upon social protection system. The paper also highlights aspects related to political stability, and Jean-Patrice excellently emphasized what he called promoting peace between groups. And maybe I would phrase that a little differently, but I think that our arguments are basically the same. We know, however, that promoting peace is more easier said than done many times. And what needs to be emphasized is stability in the country, political stability. And there might be fear among both refugee populations and host communities. Fear against each other, fear in relation to security apparatus, fear for insecure livelihoods, etc. And when vulnerable populations are somehow in competition between each other over scarce resources, that is something that is not facilitating social protection systems. There might be fear of tensions, social instabilities. There might also be attitudes of racism or xenophobia or hostilities in different ways. This kind of political stability and political will, if you'd like, is also something which is changeable. It's not a stable factor in any country. That it changes with the political considerations, etc. And I think Lebanon, although perhaps an extreme example, it's so extreme that it actually illustrates the point very well, because Lebanon has been host to a large Palestinian refugee population since 1948. And has been a host society to a large Syrian refugee population, increasing since 2012, and where there is also an increasing rate of poverty among the citizen population. So when those factors like coincide, and when there are different groups competing for scarce resources, the political will or the political inclination or the political possibility even to actually include refugee populations in social protection systems might be at risk or scare. So linked to this is also the political feasibility. So if there is a high rate of poverty or vulnerability among citizens, while there is also a scarce social protection coverage, when that coverage rate is low, then priority may often be given to extending coverage to citizens rather than to refugees or forcibly displaced. So this kind of recognition of different kinds of vulnerabilities, and to try not to play them out against each other, but to treat all vulnerabilities in the same kind of way might be a stabling factor. Lastly, I would just like to emphasize that the report also points out something else, which both Jean-Patrice and Sayad also emphasized, the lack of data and the lack of inclusion of refugees and forcibly displaced in data systems. It is something which hinders social protection systems, because then governments don't know whom to cover. And here there are also some interesting aspects in the report about how technological aspects could help in providing better data availability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. Very interesting recap of the main findings, and of course the question of the lack of data and lack of evidence is something that we here at the OECD are very eager to change, and cooperate with all of you to increase the quality of the data so we can better tackle the problem. Turning now to the World Bank, Eric Zapatero Lario, what are your main conclusion? I know it's difficult to be the last one when you get the same question, but so far everyone has managed to bring out and identify very interesting facts. So no pressure, but what is your take on the conditions that we need to have in place to enable better and more effective inclusion of forcibly displaced people in their host countries?
Thank you, Raga. Thank you to the OECD for inviting me to this dev talk on a very, very important and relevant topic. As you said, most of the points have already been raised by my colleagues, so I'll try to be short in my intervention. One of the issues that has been raised several times, but I think it's worth it to highlight one more time, is the importance of incorporating forcibly displaced people into national policy and planning, and specifically on social protection, because we see in many countries that these groups are often excluded from national policies, and their inclusion needs to be a first step, right? But however, we know that an adequate legal and policy framework is very important, but not enough. This legal and policy framework needs to be translated into operations. And for doing that, it is very important to invest in national social protection systems in which forcibly displaced people can be integrated. As our colleagues said, there is no need to create a specific parallel system for them, but rather tailor national systems to be able to assist them as well, and to consider their own specificities and adapt the delivery systems in such a way that these target groups can also be properly integrated. While translating policies into operations, what we see very often is a very important gap in capacity from the level where the policies are discussed, which is the central level, to the level where policies are to be translated into operations. Most of the countries hosting forcibly displaced people have national commissions to deal with that. But we see that the level of understanding sometimes is not enough to be able to translate those policies into real action. And we see, for instance, many countries where the freedom of movement is clear or approved at the policy level, but IDPs or refugees still face a lot of problems while trying to benefit from that freedom of movement, because the level of understanding is very different from one level to the other. And there are many, many examples for that, as the right to work and other issues that are officially approved or clear, but do not translate into action. Another point that is very important is to understand the context and vulnerability of forcibly displaced people. We know that their situation is very dynamic. And in this sense, it is essential to have adaptive programs and systems. Programs and systems that can be scalable, and programs and systems that can have financing that would enable to rapidly respond to shocks or to crises that often hit this type of populations in a much more important way, right? As many of our colleagues said, it is important to make sure that interventions cover the whole scope, from prevention and protection to promotion of economic development. And in this sense, coordination among the stakeholders is extremely important, not only to avoid duplication in effort, but also to enable multiplier effects. And here I'm talking about local authorities, government entities, but also the UN, the World Bank, NGOs, and other stakeholders, which are very active, not only in humanitarian response, but in development. When we talk about mid and long-term goals, as we are talking here, obviously multi-year financing is essential. We need to set mid and long-term goals to support forcibly displaced populations, because we know that some of these people stay in their situation for a long time, and sustainable support through economic inclusion is very important. And multi-year financing has also allowed to build proper systems and to increase coverage over time, which is one of the challenges that we see in many of the countries hosting large numbers of forcibly displaced people. Donor financing instruments should exist that focus specifically on forcibly displaced people, and I will talk about this in the next question if you allow me. We have seen that specific windows to support host communities and refugees can be very effective and very efficient, and it's something that I would encourage other donors to do. And one last point that I think is very important as well is to build evidence, right? So we have been discussing about monitoring, but I think that also building the evidence on measuring the financial and social impact that interventions supporting forcibly displaced can have on mid and long-term goals is very important to have governments more engaged in supporting this type of interventions. We know that prevention and resilience activities have a huge impact on finances in different countries rather than focusing on emergency response. And our colleagues have also discussed about the social impact that not having this type of intervention could bring in areas where there is a very large inflow of forcibly displaced people, and host communities, they have to share the livelihoods and they have to share the space with them. So the impact is there, but measuring it and building the evidence and sharing it with decision makers should be something very important to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. And I have to say, what an excellent first round of insights. Through the different perspectives, you all managed to bring in new viewpoints to make this paint this a whole picture of what we're discussing, and I through that I feel like we have a pretty clear picture of what conditions would enable better inclusion. And now in this second round, let's discuss on how to put them into practice and what the benefits of better inclusion are for both the people who have been displaced as well as the hosting countries, because as was so well put by Jean-Patrice, peace and harmony is an important factor. So it has to be to the benefit both of the displaced and the hosting countries. So if I could ask, start with you, Sajjad Malik, to ask you what the concrete benefits of inclusion policy for displaced people themselves are from the UNHCR. Mr. Malik, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Again, if I'm not clear, I'll switch off the video again, but you let me know if I can continue like this way. First of all, thank you very much, all colleagues who have given excellent summaries of the perspectives that they have. And I think all pulled together reinforces the message how important it is to have inclusion of forcibly displaced international systems, what benefits it could bring. For UNHCR, it is a part of the 1951 convention. This is within our legal system that inclusion is what protection is. And we say protection and refugee and inclusion go hand in hand. The more the inclusion, the better the protection around that. Now we have heard about challenges. We heard about in countries where there are opportunities that the legal systems allow refugees to have access to markets, have access to jobs, can open up bank accounts, can go to schools, can access health services. So those countries, we know that they have more opportunities provided they are receiving the support that is required for that responsibility sharing. That is very important that we recognize, and OECD's message would be very, very important to get it, that those countries where there is possibility, they need some support. Now, there are those countries where legal systems are not as advanced in terms of inclusion of refugees and host and forcibly displaced. Their efforts need to be made. And I think what I mentioned earlier with doing a lot of work with the World Bank, but also with EU INTPA, we are doing a lot of work with Denmark, US with Germany, BMZ, which are supporting those countries to help change some of those legal issues, to allow refugees to have access to markets, to allow refugees to have education, all that. And that support is getting, as Jean-Patrice also highlighted, in terms of support to the governments to change some of these policies. Slowly changing in those countries, but we need to continue providing focus there. Now, what benefits do it bring? Advancing refugee self-reliance can be absolutely a powerful advocacy tool. These people are, if we talk about 100 million displaced, imagine the potential of this 100 million blocked. And if that can be unblocked for human development, for the benefits they can bring to the host communities, the communities that they're living in, these are resourceful people who bring culture, who bring knowledge, who will trade, who bring all those values, and those need to be applied so that they can not only grow themselves as their own development, but also the communities that they are in and provide support. And we have seen in countries with open policies and supported can bring a lot more benefits with refugees there. The second important part is the access to additional financing. It's important that it's not just a burden and responsibility sharing, which is short-term, but this financing has to be multi-year. As I mentioned, they are protracted displacement. As I mentioned, Afghanistan, 30, 40 years, Somalis, then the others in South Sudan in the Eastern Horn of Africa for 20, 30 years. And this investment requires more financing, predictable international donor support that needs to get into that. And if that assistance comes to refugee hosting communities, it benefits both hosts and their refugee communities. It also enhances social cohesion, which is the peace building side of it, which Jean-Patrice so nicely highlighted. When we have communities working together on their self-reliance, integrating, there's no competition on resources that they can work together, and they have those work help social cohesion. Education provides that opportunity. Sports provide that opportunity. Health provides that opportunity. And one of my colleagues highlighted during the pandemic, that was one good example where inclusion of refugees or forcibly displaced in the preventive health mechanisms provided that massive opportunity that you cannot leave population out. They cannot remain invisible because that's not what a solution would be for that community. You have to include them into that. And from there, we looked at social protection, we looked at education. We are working with development partners with you on a number of research and evidence, like you highlighted, Reggie, a lot of good work coming up with OECD as well. And I think that's important that we continue doing that. And then eventually access to durable solutions. a educated colleague from within, a refugee from within the community, working with the host communities, will go back and contribute to the recovery of their own countries. And we have seen many of these situations where more resourceful refugees have returned home to rebuild their communities and rebuild the society. It's happening in Afghanistan right now. It's happening in many other places where those refugees who were educated had gained new benefits as a refugee in their displacement, are now contributing to society. And lastly, if I could highlight inclusion as a key component of both in terms of displacement while they are there, but also eventually when they return home. More developed rather than constrained human beings who have had the opportunity to be educated, who have had the opportunity to have jobs, and not to be living in limbo for 20, 30, 40 years, waiting for the day to return home without having to go to education or health or social protection or having any of the benefits which is their right. So for us, protection and so inclusion go hand in hand, and we move towards in that direction. Back to you, Reggie.
Thank you very much. And I was happy to both see and hear you very well during your presentation. Just before I give the floor to the next speaker, I want to draw your attention to the chat where Jason Gagnon, who is leading this work on behalf of the OECD Development Center on immigration and forced displacement, he is sharing with us two papers. The paper that was the result of the the partnership between OECD and EPA, as well as the technical input from ODI on the one hand, and then a blog on the issue that was released today. So I would like to draw your attention to that, and you can see the links in the chat. Speaking of partnership between OECD and EPA, I will direct my next question to Helena. Sayad mentioned the 100 million people that need to be unblocked, and I think that's a very descriptive terminology. If I turn to you from the point of view of the host country, how can the host countries benefit from better inclusion policies? Helena, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I think Sayad also touched upon this in a very good way. So I'll just, I think I'll extend from that a little bit. Because on the one hand, of course, host governments would benefit from having a successful inclusion policy. But governments may not always perceive it that way, because of different reasons. Like, for example, if I just bring up the case of Lebanon again, just because it's so kind of obvious, when Lebanon first welcomed the many Palestinian refugees in 1948, there was a very welcoming atmosphere towards Palestinian refugees. But that changed due to different political circumstances, due to a very horrible civil war, etc. And then with the prolonged situation of so many Palestinian refugees, and also becoming a host to a new wave of refugees from Syria, welcoming attitudes may not be so favorable anymore. And governments may perceive then refugees and forcibly displaced as sources of instability in different ways. And I think that kind of fear needs to be taken into account and problematized and considered. Also, host populations may have sentiments of insecurity with many populations, many people from other countries arriving. We know that. So I think one needs to talk about what is actually meant by an inclusion policy. How is that formulated from the perspective of, or horizon of, a host government? And how is that like presented towards the population in general? There are studies that show that if like refugees and forcibly displaced are included in social protection systems, like when they are formulated, that also kind of helps in a way, that they are not added ons, that they are not like categories that are thought of afterwards, but there might be a consideration towards different kinds of vulnerabilities already when social protection systems are formulated. On the taking that into consideration, I would like to also underline and emphasize what Sayad said, that inclusion policies, if successful, would mean benefits in terms of reducing inequalities. And if inequalities in a society are reduced, there is a facilitation of peace promotion or social cohesion or social stability. So if all are included, then the chances for peaceful, inclusive societies are increased. Also, also Sayad mentioned, workforce, of course. Maybe there are skills lacking in a host society that could be covered for with a new addition of communities or societies that bring with them new skills, education, levels of education, etc. And then inclusion might contribute to the economic development of host societies in the long run. So all those, I mean, kind of general structural factors that would be beneficial for a host government, but in the immediate time of making politics and policies, that might not be the priority of a host government or host society. So I think that there is a long way to go. And there is no easy way, I don't think, and there are no quick fixes, and one shouldn't overemphasize technical and administrative aspects of this, but really consider how deeply political this issue is. And just to extend on this a little bit further, we know that from societies in the global north, from my society and my country, that there is political opposition and political constraints against including refugees and displaced in social welfare systems. And then I do live in a country which has a long history of being a nation state, long, well established, etc. And we are talking about societies that are fragile, that do not have the same kind of long experience of being an established nation state, but where national identity as such is more fragile and more in question. So we also need to consider and acknowledge that the problems that we do believe that we face in the global north are not, the problems and challenges in the global south are not different. So a main challenge for donor countries, I think, is to understand the deep political issue in host societies in providing social protection systems for all. So just to problematize the issue, but I do agree with Sajjad on the long-term benefits. Lastly, I would also like to say again about this with the data availability. I think that is really important, that there is a development of how to register and include refugees and forcibly displaced in different data sources. However, one needs also to acknowledge that there might be risks with that because of fear amongst refugee populations of being registered and accounted for. So just pointing a little bit towards the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. This issue is certainly not an one-sided, straightforward issue. There are a lot of things to think about, and the political aspect certainly has to be taken into account in order to reach this peace and harmony that I keep referring to Jean-Patrice's comments, and maybe the how we can manage to not the word you used, problematize, to not view this as a challenge, as a problem, but as an opportunity for the hosting countries. Then we would take the debate up to up a notch, as they say. But speaking of perspectives, I would now like to turn again to Jean-Patrice with the experience from Cameroon and from your perspective, to see what the challenges and the best practices are for scaling up inclusion initiatives for forcibly displaced persons. I understand that you have more slides that we can look forward to. So Jean-Patrice, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor again. I think there was one participant who was asking me to put it in presentation mode. I quite don't see what it is. I don't know if I can continue with this one so that we can just, because...
The presentation mode is down on the right side. Yeah, there, no, little to the left now. There.
Here?
No, next one to the right. That one.
This one?
Yeah. If it doesn't work, then I suggest you continue as you have been before. We can see
This one.
Now we're in presentation mode now.
Wait, let me see. Let me close this. Sorry about this. Let me start again.
We are making your life difficult. I would suggest do it as you feel most comfortable with.
Okay. Sorry for taking the time. Okay. Now, thank you for giving me the floor. Okay, now when it comes to the challenges that we encounter with the inclusion, I think we have identified some of the challenges. First of all, we have an absence of a national body in charge of the issue of forced displacement in Cameroon. That's one of our main challenges, is that we don't have a body that is in charge of a displacement, of forcibly displacement in Cameroon. Now, there's also something else that I would like to mention. Raga, when you made the introduction, I just want to add it. I'm also in charge of relationship, not only with the IOM, but also with the UNHCR. So we work closely and a lot with UNHCR. So in Cameroon right now, we are not the ones to determine we don't have the DSR, determination of status of refugee. It's the UNHCR who is helping us to do that. So this is also one of the challenges that we have, but we had signed an agreement with the UNHCR for the transfer of data and also of competencies, and we're working on this. Now, the other challenge that we have is that we also have, we were talking about refugees and IDPs accessing documentation and IDs. We have a lack of financial resources to sustain the production of refugee card by the government, but we're also working on this, and I will come back when we talk of the best practices. Another challenge that we have in Cameroon is also a difficulty in keeping the forcibly displaced children in school, in the sites and in the camp that we see. It's because of cultural elements like early marriages. They're going into agriculture, trade. So rather than going to school, they will extend themselves in doing these activities. So it's really difficult for local authorities, for the central government to try to keep the children in school. And I would like to mention that in the refugees, we have 155,000 children who are in age to go to school, and we're working also closely. So Elena was she already mentioned the competition that can occur, and I was talking in the peaceful living between the host communities and the forcibly displaced person. We have a competition for natural resources that will cause conflict between the forcibly displaced person and the host population. And we are also trying to mitigate this one. It's not easy, but we're also working on this. There's also another challenge that we have. There's a risk of land dispossession for host communities due to the prolonged presence of refugees, and mainly on the eastern side of the country. Host community will be happy to share what they have, but there is a risk that they may be dispossessed, because in some parts, the forcibly displaced people are more than the host communities. We've been talking a lot about data. One of our challenges in Cameroon is that we have limited data on forcibly displaced persons. We don't have information. We don't have so many information on their social and their financial needs. And we're also working on this. I will also show you the best practices. Now, we were also talking about COVID-19. Now, the impact of this pandemic, it brought a lot of setbacks that hinder the access to the government response, leading to disruptions in administrative processes for the FDPs, and it also led to disruption in the implementation of programs, and also access to documentation for the forcibly displaced person. But what is interesting is the best practices that we have. I mean, the challenges are there. Sorry for the camera. I was not on stage, sorry for the camera. So we have best practices. No, I will not go into the legal framework too much because Cameroon is party to international conventions, and also at the level of the African Union. But what is important for me is to highlight that Cameroon has adopted two texts, one law on refugee status that really provides opportunities for inclusion because refugees are assimilated to nationals for economic and social right. And on our level, we think that it's one of the most progressive and inclusive legislation on refugees. In addition, we also have a presidential decree signed in 2011 relating to the organization and functioning of a structure that manages the status of refugees. And now, Cameroon is also party to the EU Convention on the assistance and to displaced person. And something that I would also like to mention is that in April 2022, just recently, we hosted a regional conference on solutions in the context of forced displacement related to the Central African crisis. Most recommendation from this high-level meeting geared towards finding ways of easing the inclusions of refugees into communities where they live. There were also, what I can also mention is that as a best practice, we have the creation of an interministerial commission for the reconstitution of misplaced or destroyed identification documents for forcibly displaced person. This is very important because we know that some of them are internal. They don't have the documents due to conditions where they had to leave their places. Now, this is the legal and institutional framework. Now, I would like to go to the best practices when it comes to social integration. Now, the state of Cameroon, the government has allocated 873 hectares for the establishment of 7 developed sites, but also a camp to host Central African and Nigerian refugees. Now, we also have our host communities that are sharing their resources with more than 70% of refugees that live outside of the camp. And I think you remember when I was sharing the data at the beginning of this discussion. Now, there was also a signing in May 2021 of an agreement between the government of Cameroon and Unhcr for free health care for refugees in public health facilities in the regions where they are hosted. Now, there's also a best practice, and the government is really keen on maintaining identical tuition fees for refugees and nationals because they're considered as national. The education is free in the elementary, but they have the same tuition fees in the secondary and in university. There's also an implementation of the out-of-camp policy that we try to apply in Cameroon. And it leads to peaceful cohabitation between refugees and Cameroonians, and we're taking special arrangement so that they can also access land in association with these host communities. Now, there's also something that we're really keen on doing, and we're really, it's a nationwide sensitization against the stigmatization of IDPs, internally displaced person. You can imagine this has been, but the government has special programs to educate population on IDPs and refugees. Now, when it comes to data, I mentioned that there's one backlog that we have. It's about data, but I'm really happy to announce that we have a flagship household survey. It's the implementation of a new initiative with the Unhcr for the integration and harmonization of surveys targeting refugee household. Now, this initiative, this household survey, will aim to provide data on living condition of refugees. Then it can enable the government and its humanitarian development partners to optimize decision-making. So we can have the decision-making in collaboration and really looking in the same direction. Now, I also like to stress out, and I thank Eric Zapatero for being there from the World Bank. There's a lot of programs that have been carried out, and refugees are included in a social assistance program through World Bank IDA 18 refugee and host community sub-window and social safety net project. There's a lot. I think maybe in the Q&A we can come back. There's a lot that has been done. Now, this was at the social integration. Now, when it comes to financial and economic inclusions, the best practices, you know, we have our national social protection policy that outline the areas of support. And one of those areas is the promotion of economic integration for vulnerable people. Now, the government is taking very seriously that it is included when it comes to employment and the access about improving the access of vulnerable population to economic activities. I would also like to stress out what is interesting here is as part of the implementation of our national strategy to combat gender-based violence, the Ministry of Promotion of the Women and Family made sure that we started with 100 vulnerable, disabled, internally displaced and refugee women and girls were empowered to revive their income generating activity. And also we formed 200 peer educators in the culture of peace, the fight against intolerance, living together, and also very important, preventing COVID-19. Now, also one of the best practices and one of the what we had was that a tripartite framework was signed between the National Employment Fund, the International Labour Organization, and the UNHCR for the inclusion of refugees in employment programs, Cameroonian employment programs, in the pledge to partner the government National Employment Fund. Now, talking of the UNHCR, are one of our basic partners. They provided cash transfers and in-kind support to at least to nearly 50,000 refugees from the Central African Republic via the Transitional Safety Net project. So this is also something that we're carrying out, and it's working quite nicely. Now, I would like to close with a prospect. I'm sorry, I hope that I'm not going over my time. There's prospects for us in Cameroon. There's a creation of a national structure for the management and the coordination of forced displacement issue. We are working on this, and it's paramount. It's very important if we want to work towards inclusion of the forcibly displaced person in Cameroon. So this is one of the prospects. The second prospect is that there's an advocacy for the ratification of the Statelessness Convention. I think our colleague from the UNHCR, he talked about it. It is important. It's not only internally displaced refugees, but we also have those who are stateless. So it's very important for us to advocate for Cameroon to ratify this convention. Another prospect is to advocate for the production of refugee cards to be included in the government budget to ensure sustainability in this activity. And I would like to highlight that the World Bank Group has put some funds for this activity. And last but not the least, it is important to have a greater inclusion of refugees in measures that aim at mitigating the risk of statelessness, very important, through their inclusion in government policy. I would like to stop here, but I would like to close saying that every effort that the government of Cameroon is making, it is to ensure three things: the protection, socio-economic well-being, and psychological welfare of the displaced people, of the displaced person. And it is very important. And ultimately, this will lead not only it can lead to their repatriation or resettlement, and it also will help their dignity and their determination, the self-determination. And in the end, you can see it was mentioned, they will contribute, for those who are still here, to the socio-economic welfare of Cameroon. I would like to close by saying that we expect the international community to effectively implement, we really implement the recommendation of the Global Compact on Refugee, mainly the sharing of burden and responsibility that related to prolonged reception of refugees. I would like to thank you for your attention and hoping that in the discussion we can bring some more answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste, and I forgive you for going a little bit over time because this was extremely important and a very good introduction, because you mentioned the UNHCR, you mentioned the World Bank, and I would like to now turn to the World Bank. As Jean-Baptiste described very well, this needs to be financed. So turning to the World Bank, Eric, how is it possible? How can we make sure that the incentives or the initiatives for the inclusion of forcibly displaced people get sufficient funding? An easy question here in the end. And I would like, before I give you the floor, to encourage people to post their questions in the chat, because after this intervention, I will open the floor to the public.
Thank you very much, Raga. So obviously the financing question is a tricky one when it comes to discussing financing in low and middle income countries. When we look specifically at forcibly displaced populations, so obviously in the past, most of the financing has gone to humanitarian responses and transit response, which is obviously extremely important. But we know as well that, for instance, refugees, they stay in refugee camps for several years, as most of our colleagues have said today. Obviously, this shows the importance of supporting multi-year financing. While humanitarian response is extremely important, as I said, multi-year financing should also focus on several issues like the necessary policy development, if these policies are existing or not comprehensive enough, building broader social protection system that would provide host governments the confidence to engage in progressive expansion of social protection to displaced populations as well. And this is important because we know that in most of the countries hosting refugees, the coverage of social protection is still very, very low. And particular attention should be paid to building or to financing systems that can build resilience and be shock responsive as an element of more effective use of social protection expenditure. When it comes to sustainability and when it comes to making more financing available, we have to focus on two issues. First of all, is how to put more financing on the table, which is always difficult, but also on how to make expenditure more efficient, right? So when it comes to make more financing available, we can have two main options. One is to promote fiscal reforms in the countries and increasing specific donor support, right? Fiscal reforms obviously are very context specific, and I wouldn't be able to say which type of reforms have to be promoted in all of the countries hosting refugees. But a very common example is, for instance, to look at policies or programs that mainly benefit the better off, like fuel subsidies or subsidies, and see whether there is a space to reform this type of policies and free some fiscal space that can be dedicated to programs that are targeting the poor or the most vulnerable, in our case, the forcibly displaced population. And another way of also creating additional fiscal space is to harmonize programs. We see that in many of our countries, fragmentation of social protection is very important. Very inefficient expenditure in social protection. So harmonizing programs, international programs is a much better use of the resources. This could also create some fiscal space to
excuse me, Eric. Eric, is it possible that the sounds got worse? It's not that you're breaking up, but maybe you left or went a little bit too far from your microphone.
Okay. Is it better now?
This is much better. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you. I was saying that harmonizing programs can also lead to freeing fiscal space that could be important to increase coverage of interventions. I said before that also making expenditure more efficient is very important, and there are several activities that could be implemented. We said before that having parallel systems can lead to very inefficient use of the financing. So building international systems that integrate forcibly displaced populations is in most of the cases the most efficient solution. Enhancing government capacity for an effective management of refugees, hosts, and IDP is also an investment and also increases the efficiency of expending. Investing in more efficient delivery systems, and here I'm talking about social registries, payment systems, GRMs, can make savings to programs of up to 10%, which is something that is not negligible. And on top of that, investing in partnerships between donors, UN, and other stakeholders that avoid duplication and make multiplier effects, is also a more effective use of the existing financing. And the third option that I said before is a specific donor financing on instruments that focus specifically on forcibly displaced people. And as some of the colleagues have referred before to the IDA window for host communities and refugees, if you allow me, I will just spend 2 minutes and explain a bit more what this is and how this works. So this window is a specific window from the World Bank to support host communities and refugees with the objective of supporting operations that promote medium to long-term development opportunities for refugees and host communities in IDA countries. And the main goals are to mitigate the shocks caused by the inflow of refugees, to create social and economic development opportunities for refugees and host communities, to facilitate sustainable socio-economic development of refugees and host communities, and finally, to strengthen the country preparedness and capacity to receive and increase or potential new refugee inflow, right? So the type of activities that is supported by this specific window goes from the promotion of refugee and host community welfare through safety nets and cash transfers. We also support legal solutions or policy reforms with respect to refugees, such as promoting the freedom of movement, formal labor force participation, identification documents, resident permits, and this type of things that are very important enablers for the inclusion of internally for forcibly displaced people. We also support access and quality of services to refugees and host communities for education, health, water, or energy. And as I said before, there is also financing to support livelihoods and socioeconomic inclusion for refugees and host communities so that they can, in the mid and long term, integrate socioeconomically in the host countries in a more sustainable manner. The allocations by country vary a lot and are usually defined at the beginning of the data cycle. But just to give you an example, it goes from $10 million to $500 million, depending on the needs and the scope of the program. And there are only 3 eligibility criteria for countries to apply to that window, which are to have at least 25,000 refugees in the country, or to have at least 0.15 of the population being refugees, to have an adequate framework for the protection of refugees, and this is something that we work together with Unhcr, and this protection framework is monitored and evaluated on a 6-month basis. And finally, the country needs to have in place a strategy or a plan that describes concrete steps towards supporting refugees and host communities in the mid and long term. So we had already 2 cycles of IDA with this type of window, and it has worked extremely well. So I'm happy that our colleague from Cameroon also referred to it, because we see that in many countries that apply to that window, both things, the policy dialogue has improved a lot, but also the operations, specifically targeting forcibly displaced populations, have been much more efficient and effective, and we see much more appetite from governments to integrate these target groups into national policies, because as I said before, the impact is being measured and we are building evidence on the financial but also social impacts of this type of instruments. So I'm going to stop by here, and thank you again for inviting me to this talk, and I look forward to any question that might be on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. This has been extremely interesting, and like I said, the whole picture has been painted by the excellent quality and diversity of our distinguished panel. We have a bit of time for questions and answers. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I would like to point you to a lot of information that is being distributed in the chat, but I won't repeat what is there. So I just point out that you've got mail, but we have here at least 3 interventions that we will have from the floor, which I very much welcome. And I would like you to be, for the sake of time, pose your questions or your comments concisely. And what I will do is that I have 3 interventions that have been asked for, and I will give each of you the floor and then ask my distinguished panel to respond. First one who has asked for the floor is Christy Love, Senior Research Officer at the Overseas Development Institute. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the organisers and speakers of today's event. Really, it's been a fantastic discussion, and I'd also like to thank, on behalf of ODI, I'd like to thank OECD and EBA more broadly for the opportunity to collaborate on this piece of research. So just 3 very quick points that I think are worth emphasising. Firstly, as we've heard from kind of the various cases that have been mentioned in today's discussion, I think it's worth bearing in mind that there really is no one-size-fits-all strategy or approach to this, and that's something that I think is very well emphasised in the report itself, because we've heard so much variation in terms of not just between host country contexts or host region contexts, but actually how different displaced populations within a country may well have very different experiences and de jure and de facto access to their rights, and also different subgroups within those displaced communities. So I was very encouraged to hear the Cameroon example of the specific project, for example, for displaced women and people with disabilities. That kind of specialized focus is really key to have in mind, which then takes me on to my second point, which is also the need to kind of bear in mind or manage our expectations about what this inclusion agenda can achieve, which is extensive, but also what it will not be able to. And that doesn't just mean being realistic about the kind of state of a country's current social protection system. It also means bearing in mind that there may be some displaced people, within specific minorities that actually may not ever be very well served by the state social protection system for a whole host of reasons. So that's why I think it's good that the report also mentions the importance of and the complementarity of civil society and community organizations that will continue to be able to support some of the people who may not be able to access state systems. And related to that too, we've talked today a lot about inclusion. Inclusion is a very important first step, but displaced people typically have different and also higher levels of need than even very vulnerable members of the host population. And so understanding that next step as well, that it's not just about getting access to the social protection system as it currently is, but it's also about how to adapt the social protection system to meet the needs of displaced households as well, which is another challenge, but one that many countries are really taking on with great results. And then very good, quickly, final point, it's already been mentioned by several, but I think it's well summed up in the statement that actors really matter more than factors in this agenda. And by that, I mean, it is about the political actors involved, the different stakeholders involved coming together and how they work together. That is what will determine the kind of achievements that we make on this, much more so than any kind of specific contextual traits. So which is why it's great to see so many people on the call and hear such interesting presentations from those who are really engaged in making progress on this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. Actors matter more than factors. I like that. It sums it up. Do we have a Noemi Cascone, Project Officer for Human Mobility at Annabelle?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, but we cannot see you.
Yeah, sorry. I'm also having some internet issues. But I'm trying to turn it on, but it might not work.
There you are. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the interventions. It was really, really interesting, and a lot of the informations have already been shared. I just wanted to present a little bit the perspective of a practitioner's actor, like as Enable, the Belgian Development Agency. So I'm working as part of the human mobility team at Enable at the headquarters, and we implement a variety of programs that have as goal the inclusion of forcibly displaced people. And this is, one might wonder, what is the role of a development actor in working with forcibly displaced people? But I think it's exactly the theme of today's intervention on inclusion, where it becomes very relevant, as it is going from like working in the nexus in fragile context, and going from humanitarian to development actors, otherwise illustrated by what a lot of the interventions said, which is not to create parallel system, but to have integrated services. And so what I wanted to present is to give a very concrete examples of what Enable does, for example, we work at 3 levels. We've the main and the most defining one is at the systemic level, and that is the one that we've touched upon the most today, and that is for example, very concretely to help our local actors, let's say in Uganda, who are refugee hosting districts, with translating, for example, national policies for the territory. So that might be, for example, on technical training and vocational education, and how to translate that based on the needs of the territories, and how to take the planning of refugees into question. We do that, for example, also in Burkina Faso, where we have a territorial approach of integrated services, where we work on building capacity and working on increasing the responsibility of responsibility feeling of the local actors with regards to, for example, planning, but also budgeting, monitoring, data collecting of displaced people, but also monitoring their inclusion levels. And that we do also with decentralized services, where we also work, as in Uganda, on the translation of national policies at local level. The second level that we work on, it's more the territorial level with the actors of the territories, and that means religious leaders, for example, or groups of women representing women, or refugee groups, and that we work on social cohesion work. And that includes also working with local communities, so making sure that everyone has equal access, and that has also been something that has been mentioned today. And perhaps the last level, and I'll be very quick on this, is to make sure that refugees and forcibly displaced people in general have access to information about their rights and about the services that are available to them. So, for example, services when it comes to opportunities for employment, or when it comes to opportunities to have civil registration, and so on and so on. So those are the 3 levels that we work on. And thank you very much for allowing me to present this and explain what we are doing in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. It's very, very interesting to hear about your important work. The final intervention from the floor is from Delphine Drapeau. She's the program manager and policy officer for INPA at the European Commission, which was mentioned here before by UNHCR's Sajid Malik. Delphine, you are.
Yes, I'm here. You. I don't know if you can hear me.
You may take the floor. And
okay. Okay. So yes, I'm. Okay. So as you said, I'm Delphine Drapeau, and I work for the thematic unit of INPA on migration and forced displacement. I'd like to say first that we have another thematic unit that works specifically on social protection that's also very engaged on this issue. I'll just point to a few things on what we're doing in this area. One is relating to our policy. We have the inclusion of forcibly displaced person in services, in national services, as part of our policy. It's within our Lives in Dignity communication that was published in 2016. This also mentioned, and that relates to what was said quite a few times during this session, the need to be context specific and to be conflict sensitive also when we look at the inclusion. So that's also something that we're looking at. The nexus approach was also mentioned a few times, and that's also something that we at INPA we're trying to do with the other services of the Commission. And here I'm thinking in particular of DG ECHO, of FPI, but also of the EU External Action Service. Another point that's important relates to the funding. So I'm sure many of you know that we have a specific indicative target on migration and forced displacement within the Global Europe program, which is our instrument for 2021 to 2027. That target is of 10%. Again, it's migration and forced displacement. It's not only forced displacement, it's also indicative, but in order to monitor that, we've established a marker to look at all the actions we developed and how they contribute to forced displacement and to the specific objective of the inclusion in national services. And what's interesting is that there may be actions within that are dedicated fully to forced displacement, some that are partly focusing on forced displacement because they relate more to as precisely the inclusion in services. So those would be action that would contribute to services for both the population, the host population, and the forcibly displaced. And when the inclusion is more minimal, and we talk about then mainstreaming, this action won't contribute to the marker, but we still look at inclusion whenever we can, when we look at actions for forcibly displaced. When I look at what helps us do that, I'll point to our partnership with Unhcr. It's been mentioned. Some of it relates to the recommendations of the report you mentioned. One of these is the inclusion in data, and we contribute with our partnership to the Joint Data Center of the World Bank and of Unhcr. We also participate and contribute to the various regional refugee support platforms. And also we benefit from Unhcr's advice on how to include forcibly displaced in our programming at country level. And there's more and more exchanges, and there will be more and more for sure in the coming years at country level, especially on this aspect. Thank you very much. And thanks a lot for the report, all the intervention, and in particular, it was very good to have the illustration of a particular case of Cameroon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that it's important to hear the what you are doing at the European Commission, and INPA, of course, is a great partner of the Development Center in many areas and in many regions of the world. So I welcome that very much. We are out of time, but I'm going to pretend that it's 5 minutes till that is 25 minutes past, and we still have 5 minutes, because I would like to give our panelists just 30 seconds, and I'll be brutal and ask you to stop if there's anything that you would like to conclude or in react to in what the interventions, what was said in the interventions. Starting with Helena Lindholm, would you like to take the floor?
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly, thank you so much for those additional interventions that were also great. And again, thank you. I agree. It was really, really excellent to have this picture from Cameroon. Just one thing that I forgot to mention is what Christina brought up with the NGOs. I think it's important to recognize that a lot of although not called social protection systems, but social protection activities stem from different kinds of host, like parts of host communities, small-scale grassroots organizations, and there are a lot of creative innovations there. So I think to pick up on that and try to be more systematic in knowing what is actually done and how could we learn from that. I need to leave right now. I'm very sorry for that, but thank you so much for an excellent event, and I won't take more time. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Helena, and thank you for a good partnership in the publication. Eric from the World Bank. 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. I think this has been an excellent discussion. We have covered a lot of different points on, from preparedness to prevention to inclusion. We have covered points on how to develop important policies and how to translate those policies into action, and more important, how to finance those policies. Obviously, it is a very complex issue because we have many different links. Colleagues were saying links from humanitarian to development, but we have also some links between sectors, and this type of coordination and harmonization is never simple. But I think we have to build on the good work that a lot of countries are doing. We have heard about the Cameroon case, but there are many other countries where things are being done in a very, very good way. Building on this type of experience for the future, also to share the impact that this can have and to continue advocating for this type of things. I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much for inviting me to this talk.
I am so sorry. I was probably talking over you, but that was because my earphones died and I was trying to fix that. So my apologies if I did. I believe that Syed Malik had to leave for another call. I don't know if that is true. Yes, I see that he has left. So Jean-Patrice, I second what everyone has been saying. It has been very good to have the hands-on experience that you have been sharing with us. 30 seconds, final words.
Well, thank you very much for once again inviting Cameroon to share your experience. It was really insightful. So just wanted to say what we think is that inclusion is everyone's business, and that's what we think. And we should unite to address challenges that are associated with forced displacement. That's what I would just like to mention. And we are open as a country to continue to work on it. And I would like to thank the OECD and especially Jason and Sophia for making the connection and preparing everything. And I would like to thank you also, Raga. And we stay in touch. We're open to continue to work because we think that forced displacement is really important to target and to address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. I think one of the important takeaway leaving this discussion is the urgency. We see how urgent the issue is. The number we have mentioned, 100 million, and how protracted the issue is. As the majority of the forcibly displaced people have been displaced for over 5 years, so it's a problem that doesn't go away very easily. And it's a development issue. Over 80% of forced displacements happens among low and middle income countries. So that's another takeaway. But the promising news, however, and we've heard that also from the panelists here today, is that there are a number of very concrete actions that both host and donor countries can take to better include forcibly displaced people in social protection programs. And we have good examples. They haven't been discussed in depth here today, but countries like Colombia, how they managed the arrival of the 1.8 million Venezuelans, and now how the EU is handling and other countries are handling the arrival of Ukrainians fleeing the war in Ukraine. So the political aspect was mentioned, and of course that is very, very very important factor in all of this. Going forward, just finally, the OECD Development Center and the Development Co-operation Directorate, we will continue to work together on this issue in several ways. For instance, through our analysis of inclusion of forcibly displaced persons in national development and donor plans, including through territorial development, through a territorial development lens, and by mapping and mobilizing peace actors such as ambassadors, community leaders, CSOs, spiritual leaders, etc., and by issuing practical guidance and evidence that is, like I said before, our forte, if you will. Again, heartfelt thanks once again to our extremely qualified and wonderful panelists, our dear partners, EPA, Unhcr, ODI, and of course DCD, our colleagues across the hall, for coordinating this and co-organizing, this Dev Talk with us, and of course to all of you who joined the discussions here today. A big thank you, and I look forward to seeing this issue develop further in our good cooperation. Have a great day.